Today, I'd like to share some ideas about caste from the book by Isabel Wilkerson, having to do with what we call dominant group status threat. In the caste system, your caste is being threatened and might be replaced sometimes by a lower caste, and that really creates a sense of displacement. If you're in a lower caste, and somebody from that caste who you thought was below you is achieving kind of a higher position, it's like you get kind of all upset about it. Um, Good example is when a black man becomes president, as was the case with Barack Obama. Those from the lower caste who are white look at that and say, "Hey, what's happening here? You know, we thought that this caste was lower than us, and now all of a sudden they're taking kind of a higher position, and we're like, you know, what's happening here? It seems something is upsetting us, and this shouldn't be happening. You know, it's against the rules of the system that I was used to, that I grew up in. I was always thought that there was a caste kind of beneath me. Now it seems like someone from that caste is achieving a higher position that, you know, I've achieved, and we become disorientated when that happens. And so the sense is, well, we've really got to do something to take our country back. It seems like there's a group now that we thought was kind of lower. Now they're rising up. Gee, what's going to happen? And people get upset with that, and you can understand why that would happen. This has led to something that's very interesting, unusual that happened around the time President Obama assumed office as the first black president. There was a rising mortality rate for white middle class men between the ages of 45 and 54. And this was something that was unique to the United States, and it was very unusual. To a certain extent, opioids contributed to that, alcohol abuse, but a lot of it was this threat from this lower caste now assuming this position of superiority, and people finding that obviously difficult to cope with. Working class whites are the ones who most want to keep blacks in their place because they feel most threatened by them. Gunnar Myrdal discovered this in his research. And at first he was like, you know, why is this happening? But then as he examined it and looked at it, it kind of made sense to him because the lower caste replacing the higher caste is going to be a real problem. When you look at it in terms of a great social movement like the New Deal, which brought a lot of progress to a lot of people who were in difficult circumstances, it brought better certain working conditions, strengthened unions, expanded the economy eventually. And people were wondering, well, you know, why is it that those in the black working class did not achieve as much? And when you look at the New Deal reforms, they're interesting because it really excluded most black workers, excluded domestics who were predominantly black, and farm laborers who were predominantly black. So these two classes were left out of these New Deal reforms. And the reason was that so that the legislation could pass. And it was difficult in those days, and Roosevelt had to negotiate with the Southern Democrats, and they certainly didn't want to see this progress. You know, you can imagine if domestic workers were included in terms of minimum wage and hours and things like that, that would have been very difficult for those in the South who depended a lot on those domestic workers, and the same with the farm workers. It would have been hard for them, and so they excluded them, and then the legislation passed. But the unfortunate effect of that, of course, was that it left out social progress among so many of our African American brothers and sisters. Another example of that was the Federal Housing Administration. They barred loans in certain neighborhoods where blacks lived. We call that practice redlining, and we actually see the maps and the red line drawn, and these are a bad risk, and we don't want to give them loans, even though they might have the same economic profile as whites from a different neighborhood. They were not granted those loans, and also there were certain covenants that were put in the mortgage that would say, well, you cannot sell this to a black person. And so, again, what is that going to create? It's going to create a lot of economic hardship in the black community. The discrimination in these federal programs led to what we call the wealth gap between blacks and whites. Whites are 10 times wealthier than blacks in our country. And of course, what explains that? A lot of these practices that were just accepted. And people said, well, this is our normal way of doing business. And we didn't realize the discriminatory aspects of this and what it would lead to in terms of our country. So we kind of take a look at them today and say, well, what can we do to make sure that this obviously doesn't continue today? And that gets into fair housing laws, it gets into non-discrimination in work laws, that type of thing, which is trying gradually to turn around this economic picture, which is sincerely and greatly disadvantageous to black workers. Leads to something too that we consider, and that is the unconscious bias. And most people, when you ask them about racial bias, will say, and quite honestly and sincerely, they'll say, well, I have no bias. There's none of that in me whatsoever. I treat everybody the same. And people sincerely believe that. Um, but there's this factor that we call unconscious bias that's is part of our makeup. And it's estimated that about 80% of white Americans have this unconscious bias towards blacks because really of the culture they grew up in. And this has been studied in great detail by David Williams, the psychologist and sociologist from Harvard, who has developed a scale to measure this. And it has shown quite conclusively that this is a real factor, and a factor that for the most part, the vast majority of white people are just unaware of. And you can see, because if you grow up in a certain culture, you accept the norms of that culture. You say, well, this is what I grew up in, this is what I'm used to, and you just kind of accept that. And that's natural, and that's normal, and it's certainly completely understandable. The unconscious bias, Williams has found out, is so prevalent in America that 1/3 of all blacks have themselves an anti-black bias. So it's not just something that we find in the white community, it's something that is also in the black community. And so it becomes part of the whole situation of caste that people kind of accept and say, well, this is the way it is, this is the way it should be. We don't reflect on it, we don't really try to change it. And we point out like certain examples of progress, and certainly there's been a lot of progress that's been made, and that's great and that's wonderful. And yet we don't see the other aspects where there has not been that progress. And we don't want to face it, and we don't want to talk about it and say, well, what can we do to make this situation better for everyone? And certainly if it's better for our black sisters and brothers, it's going to be better for all of us in our country, because it's going to lead to more understanding between the races, more racial harmony, and that's always a good thing. Interesting study was done by Deborah Pager, and he published it in the American Journal of Sociology in the year 2003. And when you first hear this study, it sounds kind of shocking. It's almost like, I really can't believe this. But Pager's study revealed conclusively that white felons applying for a job were more likely to be hired than blacks with no criminal record. And you're like, hey, this doesn't make sense. Usually, if somebody is a felon, it's difficult for them to get a job. It's harder than the person who has no criminal record, obviously, because employers are a little bit suspicious. Certainly, many employers will initiate wonderful programs to help those who are transitioning from prison back to society, and that's a good thing, a positive thing. But in the normal course of events, you you would expect a black person with absolutely no criminal record to be hired before a white person who was a felon. And Page's study found that that is not true.